is on the call. So thank you so much for joining our session today. It's all about enhancing learning with midterm student feedback. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Peter Ufland here from the Political Science Department to present. Now, before we begin, just our goal for our session today is really how to effectively use midterm student feedback to empower students and improve their learning. We'll discover some real-life case studies and gain insights on how to recalibrate your course to meet the needs of your students. Feel free in our session today, you can put things in the chat box if you have questions, raise that hand or just unmute and ask your question. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Ufland.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just make a suggestion real quickly, and that is that if you do have a question, actually just raise your hand or blurt it out. Feel free to interrupt me. I find when I'm teaching classes online and students are typing things in the chat box that I have trouble keeping up with their questions, which, by the way, is the kind of thing you can find out from an MSF when your students say, hey, how come you never respond to my chat box inquiries? So let me just start today before I start sharing the presentation by asking for those of you who are in here and are teaching courses, how many of you have, all 20,000 of you, how many of you have actually heard of midterm student feedback mechanisms before? Let's start with that question. Have you heard of them before?
Yes, I have.
You've heard of them. How have you used them?
Yes, I did.
You do use them, okay? All right, so you're already on your way. I guess this is sort of filling in some information of what we really should be getting of them and that from them, and that actually helps me, I think, move through some of the presentation a little bit more rapidly so that potentially we can use our time together more effectively for questions. Share all participants. Okay, I want to share. All right, so let me bring up my presentation and set up slideshow.
Look at that.
You want me to
perfect.
Individual browser screen? Interestingly, though, it doesn't seem to have changed.
Yeah, click on present, like from the beginning, that first one.
Got it.
And then that should, yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So this is, as we've obviously noted, a discussion of midterm student feedback mechanisms, which at the community college we have been using pretty consistently, at least some of us, a fair number at this point, for, I would say now going on 5 years. It's really something that I came across originally when just doing some research in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and it sounded to me like an idea that, you know, really had a lot of merit and that would be relatively easy to utilize in my own classes. And luckily I found some colleagues who were equally interested in the idea and who we all agreed to work together sort of piloting the program, and then worked to expand the program to include more faculty members. I think that, you know, one of the things in thinking about using midterm student feedback that really puts it into perspective is considering what we tend to rely on as evaluations at the higher educational level, right? And I think for the vast majority of the academy, evaluations mean end of semester evaluations, right? And those evaluations, while they might be useful for certain things, also have some really, I think, pressing limitations. Namely, as I'm sure all of us in here who teach courses could agree, oftentimes they're just not really taken very seriously by the students. We get relatively limited participation in end of the semester surveys. I don't know about you, but I would say that it's pretty commonplace in my classes that I only get about 25% participation in end of semester course evaluations. And I think further, part of the biggest problem or the biggest problem in the use or reliance solely, sorry, my dog is barking, on end of semester surveys is that their use, their purpose is to provide an overall assessment of the course. And while that may be great, it doesn't necessarily help us at the moment figure out how to improve the teaching and learning environment in our classrooms, which, by the way, may also add to why so few students really go ahead and participate in end of semester surveys, because they know that there's no real promise of it for them. So let me just, I think that we don't need to talk a whole lot about the difference in the nature of evaluations, but end of semester feedback or surveys are really summative evaluations, and they have traditionally been used more for the institution itself to evaluate, hey, how is Dr. Ufland doing? How do his students think that he is doing? It is an evaluation of the course and of the faculty member, right? And in a way, this links very much so to our summative assessments that we give our students. At the end of a semester, we give a summative assessment that is supposed to allow us to evaluate how the student has done now that we are at the end or near the end of the semester. By contrast, formative assessments that we use in the classroom, and therefore formative assessments or evaluations of teaching and learning, such as MSF, are really intended to help students learn better, right? Why do we give tests or papers or assignments of any type in the midst of a semester? It's to help find out what a student has learned, what a student has not learned. MSF function the same way in the bigger picture of the teaching and learning environment by taking a moment to say, hey, what is helping you learn in this class, right? We are getting a snapshot at a point in time where we can still correct problems, where we can still improve the environment, and therefore, hopefully, improve student performance. MSF, as I was just saying, really is purely formative in nature and in purpose. They are purely voluntary. Nobody is going to see your MSF results other than you and the person, if you are using one, who is helping facilitate that MSF, right? There is nobody in the university who's going to say, or they shouldn't be, that you must engage in this practice, right? The MSF in and of itself really is not focused on your performance as the instructor. Rather, it is focused on what is happening in the classroom. Is what you are doing reaching its ultimate goal, which is to help the student learn? So what then are the overall benefits of midterm student feedback mechanisms? I think there are a number of things that we really gain from using MSF. We have seen this pretty regularly. I think we can both qualitatively and quantitatively prove that we have had these benefits by using them. They are conducted, benefit number one, they happen at a point in time in the semester, unlike end of semester surveys, where we can still make changes. If students tell you this is not working, right, and you found this out in the middle of the semester, that is a change that you can make, and that will then lead to improved student learning outcomes. These are the biggest and most important of the benefits. But I do think that there are also some other important benefits in the form of the dynamic that it creates between you and your students, right? Doing this should help improve faculty-student rapport, the flow of information back and forth between you and your students. It most definitely gives students a voice in their class, right? Sorry. Let me just mute for this. Okay, the barking seems to be over, so I will return. Students, again, get the opportunity to tell you what they think is helping them or not helping them in the classroom. That is a really empowering tool for them. In contrast, right, if we compare it again to an end of semester survey, that's not particularly empowering because they know that it's not going to really result in anything that is going to help them in a class. I think finally that we've really come to enjoy the use of midterm student feedback because it is a metacognitive exercise, right? Part of what we have been using in MSF, one of the questions that we've been using and putting into the survey more often, more frequently, has been one that asks the students what they think they can do to be learning more effectively in the class, right? And that is metacognitive by its very nature, which I think then gets them thinking about how is all of this learning working in the classroom? So let me get to, I think, the two most important parts of this presentation, particularly if you're not as familiar with midterm student feedback mechanisms. First are best practices, and then I will talk just briefly about the two main types of MSF that we've been using at the community college. I think it is important, if you are going to employ midterm student feedback, that you do certain things to ensure that they function the way that they are supposed to. A series of best practices. First and foremost, it is really important before you give a midterm student feedback that you explain what it is and why it is being done, right? We need to tell the students, hey, this is completely to help you. It is to help us help you by finding out from you, by getting feedback from you, what is working in the classroom and what is not working in the classroom. That is a point that should be reiterated several times. As I said, I always make the point before the midterm student feedback mechanism is done to say, this is why we're doing this. When I have a facilitator who does the feedback mechanism for me, which I will get to in a moment, something that we call an SCID, a small group instructional diagnosis. That facilitator, again, reiterates right before they are actually implementing the MSF, what exactly it is and why it is being used. And I think that's important because if you think about it, right? If somebody who your students don't know, another professor, a member of the staff, whoever it is that you have asked to do the facilitation, to facilitate the MSF, is walking into your classroom and asking your students to tell them about what's happening in the class. I think it's easy for them to think, wait a second, why am I telling this person what's going on in the class? Is this going to be used to, negatively to affect my professor? How is this going to get employed? So the more times we can tell them, I'm having this person come into the classroom because I want them to be there. I'm asking them to get feedback for you so that I can help improve the classroom. The more that students know that, the more effective the midterm student feedback survey will be. It is also, I think this should go without saying really, important that throughout the process, they know that their feedback will be anonymous. It is difficult to get students, I think, to open up as much as they can or should or would if they feel like their commentary might somehow get the professor, if there's negative commentary, that might negatively impact their situation in the classroom. Two really, really important points, right? MSF is designed to be focused as closely as possible on the learning process in the classroom. And therefore, it is crucial to keep the questions that you use in the midterm student feedback as simple as possible, right? You can adjust questions however you feel is necessary. But I will tell you that for the last 3 years, right, the questions that we use almost in every survey basically amount to what is helping you learn in this classroom, what is making learning more difficult in this classroom, and what would you change if possible, right? That's it. That's a really clear set of questions that allow us to dig into what exactly is happening for them in the classroom. So simplicity, I think, is better than complexity when it comes to trying to solicit information from them about how the learning process is going in the classroom. The second really crucial thing, and I think, you know, it's really easy to mess this up, for lack of a better way of putting it, is that once you get that feedback, whether it's coming directly through you through a bare bones questionnaire, again, I will discuss this in a moment, or the more formalized process of an SGID, it is really important to discuss that feedback with your students as soon as possible. Believe me when I say that I have had semesters where, you know, one thing happens, another thing happens, and the next thing you know it's 4 weeks later and you're saying, oh, I got to discuss the feedback that I got from the midterm student feedback. And now it's week 12. And I think that the problem with that is that you leave the students with the sense that, well, why did we do that? If the professor isn't really paying attention to it, right? If we're not going to talk about it, if we're not going to discuss what we will or won't change in the class, then that really served no purpose. And maybe it was just sort of a con job. So I think it is really important to go into the classroom and say, hey, last week you guys did this. This is the feedback that I got from you. This is how I think we should deal with that feedback. And let's talk about it some more together, right? And as a final point of this, you know, I think in some ways that can be scary to some instructors, to some faculty members, right? What if you get some sort of really negative feedback, not about you, but about something that you're relying on as a teaching tool, right? I have found, you know, when I have gotten negative feedback, that it actually is really useful to me to be able to go into the classroom and say, hey, I want to stop and take some time talking about this thing. And let me explain to you why we can't change this, right? Sometimes that is just as helpful in this process as being able to walk into the room and say, oh, I got this. Let's go ahead and do it this way instead. I'll give you an example. I always use this example. I don't know if you're familiar with me. I know that we may have met at you know, professional development. I'm a history professor. Well, historians assign a lot of reading. And I very regularly get students who, as feedback, say, I don't want to do any reading. And that may be something that you would normally dismiss, right? But that kind of feedback allows me to go into the classroom and explain again why it is so important that I am giving them these reading assignments. That's a useful moment in terms of setting the teaching and learning environment as well. So what are the two main types of midterm student feedback that we've been using at the community college? And we use them kind of interchangeably. There are some classes that I think the dynamic just works better for using one or the other. The first is known as a small group instructional diagnosis, or SGID. It was the original form of MSF that was created. Essentially, the way that this works, and it is more formalized, is that I'll just give you an example. I'll go to one of my colleagues. I do a lot of this with Professor Christian Aguiar, who's an English professor, or Peter Plord, who is the teaching and learning director at the community college. And they will come into my class with the questions that we have agreed upon for that class, although, as I've already said, for the most part, we use the same questions every semester. What's helping you? What's hindering you? What would you change? So he takes those questions, one of them takes those questions, and breaks my class up into groups. And the groups sit and discuss these questions. And part of the process is that you are trying to get the groups to come to some consensus points, right? It is fine to solicit individual information from students, but MSF works best when you can find points that are affecting more than each individual student. If we can get students saying, yes, all of us, these three things are really helping us in the classroom, that's really useful information. Same thing goes for things that are not helping, that are hindering student learning in the classroom. You are always going to get individual students, like my example of the, I don't want to read anymore. But chances are most students are going to say, yeah, we got to do some reading, so let's put that one aside. If we can create consensus in the groups, that helps us to really fine-tune the main things that are helping or hurting in our classroom. So after the groups have been given, 10 to 15 minutes to discuss these things and come up with some consensus positions, the facilitator will then ask the class as a whole, now that, each group, to share their feedback, right? And this allows you to go from a consensus amongst a group of students to seeing if we can identify consensus positions amongst the entire class, right? And while this is going on, and this is very important, the facilitator is taking notes on this, but doing so in a place where all the students can see it. Why is that important? Like on the whiteboard. Why is this important? Well, we want to make sure that the students feel and can see that their feedback is being recorded accurately and that it's going to get to the professor in a form, in a way that is going to really address the students' concerns, or for that matter, the things that the students are finding most helpful. Once the facilitator has gotten that feedback from the whole class, the facilitator then takes that information and writes it up into a report. This does not need to sound as complicated as it might. Really, I don't think I've ever needed to write a report that was more than a page and a half, 2 pages, and usually it's 1 page. And you're really just trying to stick to what were the main things that these students were saying were helping them or making it more difficult to learn in the classroom, right? So this is, and then of course, the facilitator provides the instructor with that report, As I said, it's really important to get that report back quickly so that the instructor can then discuss that feedback no more than a week later. So there is a little bit of a time crunch, but I think we've found it to be very doable. The other type of MSF that we've used in those classes where it's just not going to work as well or at all to have somebody come in and facilitate it, you can use what is called a bare bones questionnaire. And this is a survey that you hand out in class, right? Or you post online, and then you have the students answer it, still obviously anonymously. The questions, again, generally focus on the same concepts. What's helping you learn, what's not helping you learn, what's less effective as a learning tool or mechanism, and what would you change about the class. I have found it necessary when using this for an online class to set up a bit of a convoluted process, because of course, if I am giving an online class a bare bones questionnaire, they can't very well email those responses back to me, because then I'm obviously going to know who said what. The responses, the feedback is no longer going to be anonymous. So I have found that it does work to have them direct those emails to one of my colleagues that I trust, who then sifts through them, creates a report, or finds a way to simply write down the information without telling me who those comments have come from. So these are absolutely applicable, small group instructional diagnosis or the bare bones questionnaire, both in the face-to-face and the online format. I have used both types in both formats of class. I've also done it in a fully asynchronous course, and have found that through the help of a colleague, that they work perfectly well. I know that it's, David, is there a way to sort of blow this up to increase the size on it?
Well, I think, for our end, yeah, go back to that page.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
It looks a little bit blurry for me. How about on the call?
Oh,
It's blurry. It's blurry.
It is
But
blurry.
if you kind of
okay.
summarize
Well,
that,
you know what? Let's
totally
not
fine.
worry
Okay.
about it. I'm going
Okay.
to stop sharing, actually.
Okay.
Let's not worry about it. All that was a copy of a report that my colleague, Professor Aguiar, wrote for me. That was a report from a small group instructional diagnosis, MSF, that he did in one of my classes, right? You can see the length of it. It is not exact. While we do want to do it within a week, I have found that especially the more practice you get with it, it really doesn't take more than an hour out of my life to take the students' feedback and put it into a useful format that I can then forward to the person that I have facilitated that MSF for. Yeah, it takes a little bit of time. You're giving up an hour and a half or 2 hours of your life, but certainly I'm willing to do that for my colleagues so that I know that they will do it for me. And I think that if anybody is interested in seeing one of these reports, I'm happy to send them to you. I'm willing to share feedback that I have received, and I'm sure that my colleagues who have done this consistently would be happy to share some of the reports that they've received or created as well, so we can get that to you. David, I realize I went through that pretty quickly, but that leaves us plenty of time for questions if people have them, or I know you wanted to ask me some questions.
Yeah, I would love to open it up to the floor here. If there are any questions for Dr. Ufland about midterm student feedback.
Yeah, let me chime in here.
Yeah.
I have had some experience, but my experience is more the bare bones questionnaire that you're talking about. What's working, what's not working, and what realistically can be changed at the midterm point, given that there is a limited time to change. So it's an open-ended thing, and I found it useful to the extent that I could identify things that I could change, but I also found it a bit depressing because there are a lot of things that I could not change given the limited time. But I think this is a very useful tool, and I really applaud you for bringing this up.
So
But
let me
given my
just,
experience in the past, I think it would be more useful to kind of structure what we are eliciting student feedback on, because each instructor is the expert in that knowledge content. I mean, that's the presumption we have. And looking at the feedback that we are seeking from students, I think should be well thought through in the following way. Uh, if we look at corrective actions, after the course is done, if we look at continuous improvement initiatives, they fall in two categories. One is process changes, the way I'm teaching the course, and the other one is content changes. Maybe there's some curricular content that is too difficult to understand, or and so forth. So process and content.
well, that's, go ahead.
I think looking at the end outcomes and then imploding them into areas for student feedback would be more useful. I've been thinking about it a lot. Instead of making it very open-ended, make them more specific. What are the online tools that you're finding difficulty with? What is the content pieces that you're finding, in which module, which content is more incomprehensible, and things like that. So end leading to the feedback we are seeking would be more useful. And all this is easier said than done. I'm just saying from my experience, that was the, yeah.
So just a couple of quick thoughts. You know, the MSF, particularly in you can make the questions anything that you want them to be, right? And if you have found it particularly useful to gear them to more specific elements of your class,
Right.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I do think that particularly on a bare bones questionnaire, right, that there's the risk of potentially overdoing. If they have 30 questions, you're not likely to get as useful feedback, I think, than if you have 5 or 6 questions, for example, right? That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, you know, part of what you were saying is that you're focusing on both the tools that you're using and the delivery of information, the materials and the process of learning. And I would absolutely agree. That is the whole purpose, or largely the purpose of MSF, that we want to find out how are the tools that we're giving them and how are the way that we're delivering knowledge working for them. I can give you a good example of that. My colleagues in the English department at the community college, for the life of me, David and I were talking about this earlier today, I cannot remember the name of it, but I want to say 2 years ago, they found what they thought was going to be the most incredible online tool that they were going to be able to use for their students. And the feedback that we got back in MSFs were, this thing makes no sense. It is making things more complicated. It's hard to figure out. It's repetitive. And so obviously that's a useful thing to know and to be able to change, right? So I do think that, yeah, you can, that came through the solicitation of a pretty broad question, but they obviously then in future semesters could refine it even more to say, if they were still using that tool, hey, how is this thing working for you, right? The last thing I would say, Professor Chinta, is that at some point, you may want, if you have a colleague who's available, we are always willing to work with people. I like coming up to Van Ness, because then I get to go to Calvert Woodley to buy high quality cognac. So I'm okay with that. I think it is useful to try an SGID. It does mean giving up part of one class. And I know that's not an easy ask for a lot of people. But I think the interactive nature of the small group instructional diagnosis is in many ways more powerful for the students and what they get from the midterm student feedback than the bare bones is. Believe me, I use both because sometimes with certain classes, it just isn't going to work to do the SGID. But I think there's a lot of value in at least trying it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chinta, for that. Any other questions from the audience, from the participants here?
So I've done the SGID version at a different institution, not at UDC since I've gotten to UDC. But at UDC I use, I think, a modified version of the two survey for a particular assessment. So what I do with some of my students is around quizzes, because not a lot of students. There's a lot of anxiety around taking quizzes, right? There's a lot of anxiety around taking any kind of form of this assessment for students. But all of my quizzes are open note, open book, but they're timed. And they're referencing a text that we have not yet discussed. So they have to apply everything they've learned to something new, something that's within their purview. So for example, in my Intro to Global Studies class, my students watch a film, a documentary, and they apply all the stuff that they've read to the documentary or conversations. In order for the students for them to start to learn how to take quizzes that way, because they're really quizzes that are reading, right? It's about critical reading and critical thinking. I do what I call debriefs, where I do a survey for the students, and we go through the questions where more than half the class got the question wrong. Everybody has the opportunity who got that question wrong to receive half a point or half of the points that were lost back onto their quiz grade. So that's kind of how I've done something like this, and it helps them learn how they can better learn how they learn, because they're not necessarily always conscious about it. So going back to your point, Dr. Ufland, about why is this so beneficial for students? It's because they don't necessarily consciously know how they're best learners unless they're primed to think about it. So I wonder if that has been your experience in doing this. It's about getting students to be more conscious about the learning process. And then two, if we were to do more of this, particularly the SGIDs at Van Ness, would it be more useful to target them at different stages within a major? So say like introductory courses and then those capstone courses, as opposed to every single class, because that could get a little too much for the students.
David, I don't know if you were hearing that better than I was. It was really garbled. I don't know if it's on my end. I got the first part, I think. Yeah, can you, do you have a clearer sense of what I'm sorry, I wasn't clearly understanding the two-part question.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Dr. Garsh, I think your microphone was a little garbled. If you want to either type it out, and we can address it, or change your microphone
It was
setting.
really scratchy, and at times it seemed like you were receding.
That is so strange. Does it sound better now?
A little bit better now.
A little bit better, yeah.
Okay. Well, my point was about, do you think that regardless of the technique that you use, whether it's SGID, the two survey, or the bare bones, do you think that the process of doing this helps the students become more conscious of how they themselves learn? Because I don't think that that's a conscious question that they're actually processing on a regular basis.
Right.
And the second point was, if we were to institute this more regularly at the main branch, would it be effective to do it in, say, like introductory classes and then survey capstone classes, because there's a lot in between where you're dealing with the same instructor over and over and over again. So doing it every time might not be so effective.
So the second question is really interesting to me. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. As I was saying when I was doing the presentation, we have started adding this sort of more metacognitive question about what could you, what do you think you could do to improve, your learning in the class? And this is something that, even if on some level, right, all of these questions, a certain student could take it in one way and another student could take it another way. And they might be really surface answers or they might be much deeper, yes? But I think just by, as you said, getting students to think about, hey, I'm a participant in this learning as well. And some of the things that I am doing may not be as effective. And then, by the way, it gives students, particularly in the case of the SCID, but then if not, the instructor, to be able to say, hey, I got from a bunch of you that you're not understanding why, your note taking isn't very effective. So let's talk about this, right? Because this is an important part of learning. That's just an example. And having that metacognitive question in there, right, is important. You could even frame it as, what can you learn from your peers as a way to study or work in this class more effectively? So you can format that anyway, and we have indeed, I think, been including that more often in our MSFs. Because most people, forget just our students, don't really stop and think about how do I actually learn things and how do I figure out how to do them better, The second part about the, employing them more consistently, but also maybe more strategically at the main campus. You actually made me think about something, which is, the flip side of that at the community college is that we have a smaller catalog of courses. So I also, it's not uncommon that I have the same students go through all 3 or 4 of my courses because those are the only history courses they can take, right? And I suppose on one level, in one sense, making them do an MSF every semester isn't necessarily as valuable to them, especially if in taking my courses, they've decided, hey, I like this professor, so I want to take every one of their courses, right? So it's not as useful maybe for me. But that said, do we teach every one of our classes exactly the same way and with the same materials and with the same activities or same assessments? And so, yeah, maybe you could de-emphasize it. Maybe if you know that you have, if 80% of your class is the same class as you had last semester, maybe it is less important. But I do think that there's actually potentially some value there. I would also just say this. Every time we give students the opportunity to voice their experience and their opinion, there is no downside to that, right? I mean, I guess that if they said things like, I want you to wear better shoes, I might take offense. I've never gotten anything like that, because the questions are so much directed towards the learning experience. But honestly, I do think that it is worth 30 minutes of one of my class sessions to give students a chance to feel this opportunity to talk about what's happening there. And sorry, I keep, Dr. Chinta, did you have another question or point to make? But I did have one line. The most common comment that we get every semester is, I wish every class did this, right? And maybe that wouldn't be true for every student in the UDC system, but I am telling you, this is a comment that we get all of the time. And so I get the sense that even for my students that have done it before in different classes of mine, they still find value in it.
Yeah,
I hear you though. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Doctor.
I lowered my hand because Peter, you already stole all the words in my mouth. but I just want to add some reinforcement to what you're already saying. I think this is useful at every course, not a limited number of selected courses, because the objective is very simple. The objective is to improve how the course is being delivered. And if any changes are to be made in the process of pedagogy or in the content that is being delivered.
Right.
And since every course has different content by definition, even if the process is the same, because the same instructor is teaching, I think the content feedback will be very helpful.
Yep.
And also, content and process are kind of interdependent. Sometimes you have to change the process based on the content. And therefore, even if the instructor is pretty much the same instructor, the instructor usually changes the process by perhaps adopting new online tools. For example, I can say this in business curriculum. The capstone course has a simulation, which is managed by an external vendor. And that's very unique, and you don't have that in other courses. So the content and process are interrelated. And since content changes course by course, I think this is useful for every course. Thank you. You have said everything that I wanted to. Yeah.
David, can I ask them a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, I
See?
like that.
I'm turning the
table.
tables on
Yeah,
you.
I like
No,
it.
so my question is two parts. One, how many of your colleagues up at the main campus do you think actually know about MSF and or are using them? And two, if it's not a very large percent, I mean, do you have any thoughts on how we spread the use? Because I think it's just such a great, I've been accused of being the Pied Piper of MSF, you know, and maybe we don't need to go on a crusade, but there is almost no drawback to using them. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on whether they're really being used in a meaningful way or in a broad way. Oh, putty tat.
I see the cat.
At the main campus. And believe me, we struggle with bringing more people in at the community college. I think you might have been talking, there's anxiety about it amongst some faculty members. I don't know why, but you know, there is.
Yeah, Dr. Chinta, Dr. Yarish.
I don't know. Again, I haven't been at the main campus very long.
Right.
So I have no idea. I know that I don't use them in all of my classes. I use, as I said, a very particular kind. It's even more tailored kind when I have courses that are attached, where I have courses where I'm doing quizzes, because the quizzes I teach are not about memorization. Sure. They're about reading. And that takes time. So I do it iteratively across the semester. But one of my skepticisms of MSFs is that the information that we're getting back is not as genuine as we think it is.
Not as what?
As genuine as we think it is. And I say that coming from a skepticism of a lot of any kind of student-led feedback. And because I'm a female presenting professor and I identify as female, it's because of that as well. There is a very gendered component to all of this that does not reflect well across the boards per body. But with that said, I do think it's important to have some kind of component that allows students to reflect on their learning process and to be able to speak about and advocate for themselves. That's the two-part component of this, right? It's about advocating for themselves and about, you know, being reflective about how they learn. I think that this is one tool for that, and I think it is a really good one. And I think that in certain settings it is more useful than others, but it's also,
I am aware of the fact that I am not going to convert everybody. And by the way, and I've written, you know, I mean, I've published stuff on MSF. I am aware of the biases. the biases. And of course, MSF were created in part as a reaction to what people knew were biases in end of semester surveys. But being realistic, there's no way to truly eliminate those biases, right? Even if you're doing midterm student feedback and you're trying to finally tailor the questions to just the learning process, that will still ultimately reflect a student's perception of the instructor themselves. So I hear you. I do think that they, when used correctly or and through best practices, they eliminate some of that. But yes, you're right, of course. You know, we don't have any perfect mechanism yet for truly gauging what the learning experience is and how we can, if necessary, radically or minorly improve it. I like giving my students, as you said, the opportunity to advocate and offer whatever they have, even if I know I can't take everything at face value.
I would like to also add a question to David on this one, because David, you might know this better than I do. I also have not used MSF deliberately since we've gone through pandemic times. So if I taught an online asynchronous course, I'm sure I would use it, because there are ways in which that is one of the only kind of feedback mechanisms you have in an online course. So I actually think in that setting, that makes a lot of sense, even for me, regardless of my thoughts about whether it's genuine or not. I think it'd be useful. But what I really love about ESCID is that it's not just about individual students with the professor, it's also about the collective of the classroom with each other. Now that I wonder if that has been disrupted, or that kind of part of the MSFs have been disrupted, and how do we work on bridging those gaps, especially for faculty who are teaching in HighFlex, where it's even more, there's like more layers to that.
The asynchronous is really difficult to do that, right? Because the students are never meeting with each other. Yeah. With my hybrid, my synchronous online courses, it took a semester or two to really work the breakout room system effectively in an ESCID, but I think we've gotten there. Is it as good as it works in a face-to-face setting? The answer is no, but it's much better than when we started doing ESCIDs in live online classes. There has been a progression there for sure.
Yeah, I was going to add to Professor Ufland, because I know Dr. Yarish, you teach in the HighFlex modality, is using those breakout rooms to connect both the in-person and the remote students to foster that collaboration. I think when I think about how UDC is going forward, that's something we have to keep in mind, because those traditional face-to-face courses, they might be transitioning away, right? Because people want that flexibility, maybe not now, but maybe in the future there is. I
just started teaching them again. Don't take them away.
Well, you should become HighFlex certified.
Oh no, right? I'm okay with all that. I just love being in the classroom. It has been really great to be back.
Yeah, but I think that issue or that question about how do we foster that collaboration amongst our students, that's something that we really have to keep in mind going forward, because those flexible options, they're here to stay and also scale up, right? So just something to keep in mind here.
Professor Chinta, did you have any ideas on my question?
And my response is, I really don't know what the percentage of MSF's faculty are using. But I want to make a point as an administrator. The faculty governance is a very important principle, and it is so sacrosanct that I'm very, very cautious as an administrator to really tread this holy space. How they teach, what they teach is all faculty driven. So I'm very, very cautious when I talk about it. However, I recognize the importance of MSF, and because it is really trying to improve how one is doing. Right. So it's in one's self-interest to understand what needs to be done the next time I do the thing. But my distinction between process and content is still very valid, because the variance in process is much, much less than the variance in content, especially when we recognize that the half-life of knowledge, new knowledge creation is rapid, is so rapid that every 7 years, new knowledge completely displaces the old knowledge. So the faculty have to be aware of content improvements as a very important and integral part of course improvements.
Right. And you would hope that they're getting that through, just their own collaborations with each other, but it's not always the case, right? It is a really fine line to walk, right? Because MSF really should be and optimally works as a purely voluntary effort, right? Otherwise, it becomes seen as something that is an evaluation of you as a person by the institution. And I think that defeats the purpose. All I can say, I guess, is anytime you want me to come and talk to your department, I'll be happy to do it because I am the Pied Piper of MSF. I even have the outfit for it, okay?
I want to see that.
One example is Chat GPT. Students are telling the faculty members now. So faculty is not at the leading edge of knowledge. The students are actually telling the faculty, hey, Chat GPT gives me better stuff than what I'm learning here.
So, I mean, I think that's a good segue because I know we are running out of time, but ChatGPT is something that I've been aware of. Our students and faculty have been mentioning that to me. So please look out for something in the future with C.A.L. and
useful.
PD. Yeah, very useful. So I just do want to end. Thank again, Dr. Ufland, your presentation was great. I also want to thank Dr. Yarsh and Dr. Chinta for also joining in on the call. It was a very fruitful discussion. So for anyone watching this, either live or on this recording, if you do have any questions, just email us at calhelpdesk@udc.edu, and we can also direct your email to faculty like Dr. Ufland if you need a follow-up. Dr. Ufland, any final thoughts before we go?
No. I actually am sitting here thinking about I've got to take my wife to go see her doctor, so I need to leave. But thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your week and your day, and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter. Yeah.